you ever wondered what childhood was really like in the Victorian era? We imagine lace dresses, toy soldiers, little boys with pocket watches, and little girls with dolls. But the truth is darker, far darker. Because if parents today treated their children the way many Victorian parents did, they wouldn't just face outrage, they'd face prison. This is the story of how parenting in the 19th century was a strange, brutal, and often heartbreaking world that would be considered abuse today. But before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, put on your headphones, let the outside world fade away. This story is long, filled with shadows and storms, but also wonder and humanity. Breathe deeply, relax, and let my voice guide you back in time. And before we step into the dark parlors and narrow alleys of Victorian life, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I'd love to know. Our journey begins in the mid-1800s in the heart of the Victorian world. The streets of London smelled of coal smoke and sewage. The Industrial Revolution was booming, factories roared, trains thundered, and fortunes were being made. But behind the polished drawing rooms and the glittering mansions, childhood was not the innocent, carefree time we think of today. It was a battlefield, a test, a trial, and parents were not nurturing protectors, they were often disciplinarians, even jailers. The Victorians believed, above all else, in discipline. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a proverb, it was a creed. Children were thought of as wild, sinful creatures born full of disobedience, and the only way to make them good was to break them. Parents used whips, belts, canes, and switches. A disobedient child could be beaten for hours, sometimes until they bled. And this wasn't seen as cruelty. It was love. It was the duty of a good parent. But beating wasn't the only tool. Victorians had punishments so strange, so inventive, that they would shock us today. One example was the naughty chair taken to extremes. Children could be tied into chairs for hours, even days, their arms bound, forced into silence. Some were locked into cupboards or dark closets until they learned obedience. Others were made to kneel on stone floors, hands held up until they shook with exhaustion. If you think this sounds like something out of a prison camp, you're not far off. Victorian parenting blurred the line between raising a child and breaking a prisoner. But perhaps the most bizarre punishments were cages. Yes, actual cages. In some households, children who misbehaved were placed in wooden cages suspended outside windows, like birds. Sometimes this was called airing or fresh air therapy. The parents claimed it was healthy. In reality, it was punishment. Imagine being 5 years old, locked in a cage hanging above a crowded London street, watching strangers pass below, too terrified to cry. And yet, it wasn't just punishment that was harsh, it was expectations. Victorians demanded that children act like miniature adults, smiling too much, immature, playing too loudly, rude, asking too many questions, disrespectful. Children were trained to be silent in parlors, to sit stiffly at dinner, to bow, curtsy, and answer in clipped, polite tones. Joy itself could be scolded out of them. Childhood was not for play, it was preparation for work. By the age of 6, many Victorian children were already laborers. Factories, mines, and mills were full of them. Tiny hands were perfect for reaching into dangerous machinery. Small bodies were useful for crawling into coal seams where adults couldn't fit. Children as young as 5 were sent to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week, covered in soot, their lungs filling with dust. And the parents, they sent them, not because they hated them, but because poverty demanded it. A child was another pair of hands, another income. Love was measured not in hugs or bedtime stories, but in survival. But while poor children were sent to factories, rich children weren't free either. Wealthy parents controlled their children with iron rules, suffocating expectations, and endless lessons. Governesses drilled them in manners, music, and languages. Physical affection was rare. A hug, a kiss goodnight. For many upper-class children, these were luxuries they never knew. Parents were distant, almost strangers, appearing only for formal greetings or stern corrections. Love was discipline. Love was silence. And then there were the parenting manuals. Entire books, popular in the 1800s, taught parents how to raise obedient children. They advised withholding affection, warning that cuddles and kisses would spoil a child. They taught that a child's will must be broken, bent, shaped into obedience. The parent wasn't a companion, they were a ruler, a judge, and sometimes an executioner, and yet, things get even stranger when we look at how Victorians treated babies. Newborns were swaddled tightly, arms and legs bound until they couldn't move. Parents believed this would make them grow straight and strong. Cradles often had covers, wooden lids they closed over the baby almost like a box, keeping them silent and still. Some manuals even recommended giving infants opium syrups, yes, actual opium, to keep them quiet. One popular mixture was called Godfrey's Cordial, known among mothers as the quietness syrup. It contained opium, and thousands of babies were dosed with it. Many never woke up. Imagine that, a crying child silenced not with a lullaby, not with a gentle rocking, but with a spoonful of narcotic. Today, that would be considered murder, but in the Victorian world, it was routine. And what about education? Victorian schools mirrored Victorian homes, strict, harsh, and unforgiving. Children could be whipped for writing with their left hand, beaten for failing to memorize a passage, forced to stand for hours holding heavy books until their arms shook. And if parents thought the school wasn't too strict enough, they beat the child again when they got home. Discipline was endless. Childhood was discipline. But here's the strange contradiction, the twist in the story. Victorians also loved children. They wrote poems about them, painted portraits of them, dressed them in lace and velvet, built nurseries filled with toys. The culture idolized the angelic child, pure and innocent, a symbol of hope. But the reality was harsher. Those same children were beaten, silenced, and worked to exhaustion. The Victorian child was both worshipped and wounded, loved in theory, but controlled in practice, and some of the most shocking examples come from famous families. Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, kept meticulous notes on his own children, observing them like scientific subjects. Charles Dickens, who wrote so movingly about suffering children in his novels, sent his own sons away to harsh schools and demanded absolute obedience. Even Queen Victoria herself described children as odious and tiresome at times, and her own children later wrote of their childhoods as cold and joyless. This wasn't unusual, it was the norm. And yet, in the shadows of this strict world, change was coming. Reformers began to fight against child labor, against brutal discipline, against neglect. By the late 1800s, laws were passed to keep children out of mines and factories. Schools became compulsory. Slowly, the idea of childhood as a protected time of innocence began to take root. The Victorians, without knowing it, were paving the way for the modern idea of childhood. But make no mistake, if parents today treated their children as many Victorians once did, it wouldn't just be frowned upon. It would be criminal. Beatings, cages, drugging infants with opium, sending 6-year-olds into coal mines, these were not exceptions. They were the fabric of Victorian parenting. And so, the story of Victorian childhood is a story of contradiction. world where children were idolized in paintings but beaten in parlors, where they were dressed in lace but sent to the factory, where lullabies were replaced with syrups of opium and playtime with hours of labor. A world that seems almost impossible to us now, yet it was only 150 years ago. Close your eyes. Imagine a Victorian nursery. The walls lined with toys, dolls staring with glass eyes, a rocking horse in the corner. But listen closer, hear the silence, the suppressed cries, the discipline hovering like a shadow. This was childhood in the age of Queen Victoria. So the next time you see a sepia photograph of a sweet Victorian child, remember, behind the lace and the stiff pose may have been a life of hardship, discipline, and sorrow. And remember, too, how far we've come. Parenting today is far from perfect, but the love, protection, and freedom we offer our children would have seemed like a dream to many in the Victorian world. Thank you for joining me tonight on this long and winding journey into the shadows of history. This story kept you awake with curiosity or lulled you into sleep with its strange rhythm. Know that there are more tales waiting for you, more bizarre, beautiful, and unsettling histories to explore. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may the echoes of the past stay with you, just faint enough to haunt your imagination.